Good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. Well done on making it through security and actually finding the correct room. There may be others sort of still wandering around, but we've got you here, so that's good. We'll start with you. Excellent. So I'm Andrew Blick. I'm head of the Department of Political Economy here at King's. Very pleased to be launching Professor Stein Ringen's book. Stein's been a visiting professor here at the department for, I think you said 6 years, around 6 years, so, and been very active, very involved. It's very good to have people like that around, and we thought this looked like a very interesting book, and we were very pleased to be launching it. So this is a launch event. We're going to be talking, Stein's going to be talking, and then Professor Sarah Birch of the Department of Political Economy will be responding, and then maybe some questions. Will we take some questions possibly?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then after that, we have refreshments in a confusingly similarly named room next door, I think, but I think we can go through there to get there. And also, we're going to be selling the book, so you're all here to enjoy the event and the refreshments, and then hopefully actually buy a copy of the book as well. So I will leave it at that for now, and hand over to the author.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity to present this little and modest book. And very much thank you to King's excellent Department of Political Economy for having given this project its home. Now, the book consists of 5 essays, one on power, in which I deflate the power of power. It's the use of power that matters for getting things done, not power itself. An essay on statecraft, essentially about leadership and the importance of leadership, not just in policy, but for holding society together and organized. An essay on freedom, where I seek to restore the Aristotelian understanding of freedom as access to human dignity. An essay on poverty, in which I treat poverty as a moral problem, as that which is unacceptable and should therefore be eradicated. And an essay on democracy, where I offer a new definition of the concept of democracy, in which democratic culture is central. No constitution can function well if it does not sit on a reasonably sound democratic culture. So those are a bit theoretical, shouldn't even mention that word, I don't want to frighten anyone, not difficult, brief. The books are for sale, as you said, in the hands of the eminent Aaron and Lola, who are offering it at a very generous discount. Now, those essays I take as giving me the authority to speak on the state of democracy in the world, and I do that in a preface and a postscript which wraps around these essays. And they come with a raft of recommendations about how to think about democracy and understand democracy, and how to improve democratic constitutions in the way they function, very much with an emphasis on the situation in Britain and the US. Now, these recommendations together go to fortifying what we could call the chain of control from us citizens down here up to the representatives, our representatives up there who make policies and laws and decisions on our behalf, all the way to the international level, the European Union and the United Nations system of global government. Now, in that chain of control, well-functioning parliaments are essential, which brings me to the British Parliament, which brings me to an institution that is in struggle, in difficulty, in trouble, I would say. Just to give 2 examples on that one, we cannot not mention Partygate these days. Now, Partygate is party political, of course, but not only. It is also a display in the inability of Parliament as an institution. We are in a constitutional crisis in which the leadership in the government side is offending Parliament, and Parliament is really unable, as an institution, unable to respond or do anything much about it. Another example is the refugees to Rwanda plan, which represents an enormous change in policy in the country, in which Parliament has next to no role to play. Next to no role to play. So there is a need, I would say, to rebalance authority between the executive and the legislature, and to shore up Parliament, and to give Parliament a stronger position in that balance. And I make various recommendations to that effect, of which the central one is also the simplest one, which I want to push to you today. Forget for now, I say, the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a bizarre institution, but it's okay. It does its job. It's the House of Commons. It's in the House of Commons that reform is urgent. And I here recommend, first, that the House should take control of its own business and its own agenda. In a constitution which is supposed to be built around the sovereignty of Parliament, that Parliament is not even sovereign over its own agenda. That should be done, I suggest, with a committee of speakers which takes on the leadership of business and legislation in the House of Commons. The position of leader of the House, the government's political commissar in the House, should be abolished. That position is not only unnecessary, but it is damaging. And then robust procedures of pre-legislation scrutiny should be introduced in select committees. Select committees should be given a central role in pre-legislation scrutiny of laws and other policies. Now, 12 years ago, the House did adopt a similar reform to give select committees a new role in after-the-fact scrutiny of public policy. 12 years ago. And that reform has been excellent. That works eminently well. Only this week we have received from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee a report on the exit from Afghanistan, which is absolutely first-rate. And that reform shows both that it works to let Parliament be in control of its own affairs. Part of that reform was to put the power of constituting select committees to the House, and that our representatives in Parliament and that Parliament is perfectly up to doing excellent work, but only given proper work to do. Now, the intention then, 12 years ago, was to gain experience and to return to the matter of pre-legislation scrutiny. I mean, the scrutiny that select committees can do now is of public policies after the fact. Now is the time to return to the question of pre-legislation scrutiny. It's clear, in my opinion at least, to see that there is a need to shore up the authority of the House of Commons and to strengthen the House of Commons and with it Parliament in the balance with the executive. And this is a matter of a very careful reform, nothing revolutionary, nothing utopian, nothing high-minded. It's been on the agenda for a long time. It is entirely in the British tradition of careful step-by-step improvements. We know that it works to give Parliament serious scrutiny work to do, and we know that it matters. It's a reform that has the magic of being very simple, but at the same time both putting more work to the House of Commons and giving the House of Commons more capacity to do more work on more issues more carefully at the same time. So the good news here is that big improvements in our constitutional arrangements can be made with small policy changes. So there are you, Andrew, a little bit of theory and a little bit of practicality, and I leave it with that for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. This is an extraordinarily timely book and an extraordinarily welcome contribution to the debate on democracy. Timely, not least because the world is in a period of economic and geopolitical turbulence that is one that's more extreme than one that we've witnessed in the post-war period. It's a time when there are an awful lot of uncertainties in the world, and they probably will be exacerbated by climate change and by lots of things that we can see coming down the line, not least the attractiveness of alternatives to democracy. And so it's a time that you might say is a turning point for democracy. Democracy either needs to rise to the challenge or it needs to perhaps take a different role in the contemporary world. And a lot of people have proposed, as Stein says in his book, have proposed sort of alternative types of democracy, complete reinventions of democracy, whereas Stein's suggestion is one that I think is eminently sensible. It's to reinvigorate the current type of democracy we have and make it work better. And this makes a lot of sense, not least because we are constantly reinventing democracy. Democracy is constantly reinventing itself. So the question is, how can we do it better? How can we make democracy better? I'd like to just pick up on a couple of points. I want to say firstly that I agree with virtually all of the proposals that Stein puts forward in the book, but I would like to just pick up on a couple of points. The first one being about democracy itself, and the second one being about the broader theme of governance. And firstly, I'll start with Stein's formulation of the Aristotelian conception of freedom, which I think is a lovely formulation of freedom is something we do rather than something we have. Very often in the contemporary era, people tend to think of freedom as something they have. They have freedom as an entitlement, something they deserve, something they have a right to, in the same way as you might have a right to welfare benefits, for example. Whereas Stein points out that there's an alternative conception of freedom, which is very much more freedom is something you do. And you do it collectively with other people. It's something you perform with other people in the aim of enabling society at large to live in dignity, to live in reason, and to deliberate collectively over common problems. And that seems to me to make a lot more sense. Yes, freedom, it's important that we're uncoerced, but uncoerced to do what? Uncoerced in order that we may be able to live a fulfilling life of reason, deliberation, and dignity. And I think you could also see democracy in these terms. Democracy is not something we have, it's something we do. And a lot of times, people tend to have more sort of welfare benefit understanding of democracy. We have a good democracy, we have a bad democracy. More often they're saying we have a bad democracy, as if democracy is something supplied to them by someone else out there, by the government. And they moan about how, the democracy in the UK isn't very good, or democracy somewhere else isn't very good, as if it's external to them. Whereas democracy is something we all do, whether we like it or not, because as Stein says, it is a culture. And we are all part of that culture. It is a culture, it is a conversation. And so in some senses, you might say, well, societies get the democracies they deserve. And if they have a democracy they don't like, well, maybe it's their responsibility to do something about it. However, I think under sort of current democratic arrangements, I'm not just talking about the UK, I'm talking about quite a lot of democracies. I'm a comparative political scientist, so I study lots of different types of democracies. There are commonly two challenges that people face, that ordinary citizens face, in reinvigorating the democracies of which they're part. The first challenge is the collective action problem, as we formulate it in political science. In other words, the idea that, well, I may want to do something to make democracy better, but it only makes sense for me to do it if I know that other people are going to do it also. I mean, what's the point of me acting on my own? I won't achieve anything on my own. I need to be able to coordinate with other people who also want to do something so that we can all act together. If we have some device that enables us to coordinate so that we can all act together, then we will all be able to do what we want to do. Right? So very often people will say, well, there's no point me voting because people like me don't vote. Perhaps if you're a younger person, you might say, well, most younger people don't vote, which is true not only in the UK, but in lots of countries. And so why should I go vote? You know, the government's not going to listen to the voice of young people just by me voting if I know that most other young people don't vote. Whereas if you knew that other young people were going to vote, then the government would be forced to listen to your voice, to the voice of other people. It makes sense you should go and vote. So we need these coordination devices that will enable us all to have our say and to all take part in that conversation and that culture of democracy. So it seems to me that certain types of coordination devices, such as, you know, making participation part of our duty as citizens, as indeed, for example, jury service is something that's part of our duty as citizens, or institutionalizing that would make a lot of sense. And it seems that the point at which that could be institutionalized is the point at which people are young. Now, Stein proposes that we you give a say electorally to young people by giving a proxy to people who are too young to vote. You give a proxy to those who are responsible for them. Another alternative, of course, is to lower the age of voting to 16, as they have in Scotland and other places. And if you lower the age of voting to the point at which people are not yet adults, then it might also be possible to have every young person, when they first become eligible to vote, have them all take part, in the sense that sorts of things people have to do when they're a young person before they're fully adult. So if the first time they're eligible, say when they're 16 and 17, it comes to them to vote, voting often takes place in schools, well, you have all the people who are at school at that point vote. They have to vote. And, you know, it's like broccoli. Your parents say, if you don't think you like it, well, try it once. Well, it's the kind of try it once approach to voting. And there is empirical literature that shows that if people take part in elections the first time they're eligible, they're much more likely to continue voting later on. So you lower the voting age to 16, have everyone do it once, and that would provide a basis for continued participation later on, and also overcome the collective action problem for that age category. So they'd show them how democracy works, and it could reinvigorate voting among young people. And I think that's an extension. It's not something that Stein has proposed, it's my extension, but I think it follows logically from some of the things that you've said, and I'd like to hear you on that. A second proposal is one that Stein offers that I think makes a lot of sense, and that's to address the other major obstacle that democratic citizens face when they're trying to work out how they can improve their democracy, and that's that some people have a lot more say in decision-making than other people, even though we have a democracy, and that's because some people have more money than other people. And so if you say, well, I want to influence politics, but, you know, I don't have much time, I don't have much money, and I see these other people who have a lot more money, they can sort of buy a newspaper, or perhaps even buy an MP, buy a political party by giving a large donation. You think, well, what's the point? You know, what's the point in me doing this when I see these people having so much more influence because they're rich? So I think a proposal that Stein's put forward that I very much agree with is to publicly fund political parties and elections, and I would go as far as to ban any kind of private donation to political parties, and so that public parties are just funded out of the public purse so that everyone can contribute equally, and that there isn't this sense that people who have more money are going to have much greater say. So I think if we're able to overcome our collective action problems, and if everyone did actually have an equal say, regardless of how much money I have, I think then you could say that, yes, it would make sense to tell people, well, you've got the democracy you deserve. If you don't like your democracy, well, get involved. But I think there are still some of these obstacles in our current systems that do need to be overcome before we're at that point where we can really say that democracy is a culture and a conversation that people have to take responsibility for. But I think I agree with Stein that ought to be where we're going. We ought to be in a position to tell people you've got the democracy you deserve. And then finally about governance, Stein makes the excellent point that one of the problems with democracy is not that it's not democratic enough, that democracies very often aren't that well governed. And so I think it's important, I mean, I study corruption a lot in my empirical research, it's important to consider not just the democratic aspect of government, but the quality of governance as it's delivered to the citizens. And some of the proposals that Stein puts forward, I think, will go a long way towards remedying that. So the proposals for parliamentary reform of local government, and mechanisms to ensure that the people who stand for election are ones who are suitably qualified to stand for election. I would go even further and say that we should have certain decisions where MPs have a conflict of interest, and they shouldn't decide those things. They should be decided perhaps by another chamber in Parliament composed of a random selection of citizens, for example. And I would say things like MP salaries is the obvious one. You know, the clear conflict of interest there, and they're deciding their own salaries, but also the laws that elect them, electoral laws. And certain other things like laws on governing lobbying after they leave office, and things such as lobbying and other things, where they have a clear conflict of interest between their private interests and their public interests. Well, they shouldn't be making those laws on parliamentary standards and so forth. I suggest there should be a different body that would be in charge of overcoming some of those conflict of interest problems, and that would further reinvigorate democracy. So I've broadly agreed, given that I agree with virtually everything that Stein has said. I haven't just repeated it, but I have suggested a couple of ways where I think some of Stein's proposals could be logically extended even further to reinvigorate democracy. This is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. I very much enjoyed reading it, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Stein and Sarah. Stein also asked me to comment on his specific proposal, which I'm going to do now because it's a very interesting one. I think, as a historian, I think you're quite right that the proposal you're making about committees does go with the grain of historical development, and committees have at certain points in UK and English history played a really important role in Parliament. You go back to the 17th century and look at some of the things going on there. It was often committees that was actually driving the agenda forward. And also, when, as far back as the 1930s, when the idea of what we now call the select committee system was being developed by people like Ivor Jennings, the constitutional expert, they often actually envisaged them as having a role in legislation, that they would actually be in control of the legislative agenda. Some versions of it even had the relevant minister chairing the committee. I wouldn't necessarily support that, but that was how it was being looked at. But then, for various reasons, they ended up the way they were set up from 79 onwards, the departmental select committees in the Commons. They were given a policy role more than legislation role, but I think you're right. I think that's something that's really missing in the UK Parliament, is proper legislative scrutiny. They're pretty good at looking at policy, but what about, the legislation is clearly important, and mistakes get made, and we do post-legislative scrutiny, which is good, but it would be better to actually get in early on, so I agree with that. I'm going to put one question, also another question to Sarah, but I wonder if, so all that's correct, but I think there's an issue in the way the UK Constitution is set up, that governments rest on the confidence of the House of Commons. We have a majoritarian system, we have mainly a majoritarian electoral system. So you have a government that exists because, almost by definition, because it's got majority support in the House of Commons. So how far can we also expect that same House of Commons, which the executive has a lot of power patronage over as well, which is probably one of the reasons why the current Prime Minister is so safe, that they've got an inbuilt majority, so how far we can actually expect the House of Commons to really control a government that at the same time it supports. And it's a question. I don't know what the answer is, but but in terms of your recommendation, I think it's the next logical step. I think that makes sense. That's one thing. On to Sarah's really interesting comments. I thought that back in the 90s, when people were getting very excited about the internet, weren't they? That it was going to be the kind of answer to lots of problems, that it was going to deal with the collective action problem. Was one thing that used to get floated, that anyone can kind of anyone can start a political movement. It removes a lot of the kind of resource obstacles to organising, to being politically active, that it would mean freedom of expression, that people will be able to take part in active debates and educate themselves. That kind of thing was quite widespread. Now the internet, obviously the narrative around it has changed, and particularly since 2016, Trump, Brexit, all that, the internet's now tends to be regarded in a much more negative light. But do you think, with some of the things you're talking about, getting people involved, and democracy being a thing we do, is there still something that could be done with the internet that's positive? I don't know. Anyway, those are my two thoughts. If either of you want to say anything now, or we can go to other people's questions. I've silenced them. So, any questions from the... Yes, please. Oh, yeah. Oh, well done. Thank you. Sorry. Look at that. We've got a...
That was very interesting, Stein. I mean, I like your idea of strengthening Parliament, but I think building on what Andrew just said, it occurs to me, what chance do you think of a governing party or the governing party actually adopting your suggestion?
Should I comment on that?
Yeah, do you want to come in right away, and I think the next... yeah.
You know, if it were up to me, we would have whole-scale constitutional reform in Britain. But I know that that's not going to happen, partly because it's not the British way, and partly because I have participated in a lot of debate about constitutional reform, and I know that it's a very, very difficult thing to get moving at all. So the reason I want to push this specific issue is that it's a small matter. Well, maybe not quite as small as I'm making it out to be, because
that's a good tactic.
So I won't. It's a small matter. It's on the agenda. It's something that is possible. It could be done. 12 years ago, it was Parliament itself, the House of Commons itself, that did it. Could do it again. There isn't much momentum in the House of Commons for this today. Until recently, there was an excellent crossbench group in Parliament that was called Parliament First, that worked with people from all sides for improving the standing of Parliament vis-à-vis the legislature, and the standing of the House of Commons in particular. And one of the members of this group, while it existed, is here, so he might be able to tell us something about that. It was an excellent example of good collaboration on practical matters across the divides in Parliament. And it was instrumental in bringing forward some of these proposals. And as I said, 12 years ago, when the Tony Wright reforms, as they were known, were pushed through, the idea was to come back to this matter of pre-legislation scrutiny. So it's not taken out of the blue, it's there. But the momentum has gone out of it in the present Parliament. So somehow, this is another collective action problem, isn't it? That momentum needs to be brought back. The push, the initiative that should come for a continuation of that reform from the House of Commons itself should be forthcoming. Those of us who are interested in this should push it, because it is among the reforms that are conceivable to be undertaken. Now, I don't know how likely it is. I think it would be a step forward if there could be some momentum in the House of Commons itself. Maybe this Parliament First group could be revived, I don't know. But it's difficult. But it's not utopian. This is practical. So it's a kind of proposal that I think it's worth talking about. I have a lot of proposals in this book. Many of them are not worth talking about because they're not going to happen. But this is one that could conceivably happen, and if it did, it would be a small step, and in my opinion, would have big consequences and big positive consequences.
And for what it's worth, I think the lesson of history there might be that when you get a new government coming in early on, that's when it's most likely to happen, which the select committee system itself was when Margaret Thatcher got in 1979. One of the first things that she did was implement the reforms that were already on the table. And then they soon start behaving like a government, and they soon regretted those reforms. But that would be the time, maybe, would be a changeover to a different Prime Minister or a different party of government that wanted to say, we're cleaning things up here. And that would be my guess. Though, so maybe talking to the opposition might be the way forward. But good. I think we had we've got loads. Good. And did you have your hand up? Or?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if good, let's take threes now. I think would be good because we've got so many. That's good. So yeah.
Well, there's a scenario here that Mr. Johnson's doing your work for you. And of course, it's going to be the self-interest of the Conservatives. If they think he's going to be an electoral liability, they have to get rid of him. And that will mean Parliament girding its loins and getting rid of him. And then maybe they'll say, you know what, we can't let this happen again. And that's in the interests of the Conservative Party as well, because if they don't do anything, Labour win the next election, they could abuse the authority of a government with a majority. But if not now, I don't know that a reform... possibly a coalition government coming in afterwards would do this, but once you've suddenly got power, you don't want to let go.
Good, thank you. And can people say they are as well? That'd be useful because we're nosy.
Sorry, Nick Kaufman. I'm with him.
Thank you. And we'll make sure to get to it.
Can I just add a supplementary here? I mean, it does seem to me that this is a long-term... I mean, the relative loss of authority by Parliament is actually the result of a fairly long-term trend, which has seen a massive centralisation of power, particularly in Downing Street. Now, Thatcher was a far better parliamentarian than Johnson, and she respected Parliament more, but nonetheless, there was this steady drift. And I just wonder, I mean, it's just sort of supplementary to Nick's question here, is it going to actually take some big shock? I know you're proposing incremental, relatively modest reforms, but even those, if you're going to reverse the trend, it seems to me are going to require some kind of trigger, shock, to shake things up.
Well, we are in the middle of a shock, and it hasn't done it yet.
Sorry.
We are in the middle of a shock now to Parliament, and we would hope that but this is one reason why it is sensible, makes sense to talk about these reforms.
Good. And I think...
I'm sorry for arriving late. I think pre-legislative committees are certainly a very good idea. My recollection is when I was a member of Parliament in the 1970s that we did have occasionally pre-legislative committees. I don't know what happened in the 80s and 90s, but I think there is a precedent for them and that it would be a very good thing if they were more used. I think a more important reform than that would be to abolish the guillotine. Again, going back to when I was a member of Parliament in the 1970s, the guillotine was very rare. And in fact, the European Communities Bill, which I remember very vividly, had 106 hours of debate. Now, the guillotine is applied to all bills, and therefore a lot of bills come out of the House of Commons with many of their clauses undebated in the Commons, and the Lords then do it. But it's not a wholly satisfactory arrangement that the Lords should bear such a burden and the elected House should do so little in terms of the details of committees. Where I disagree, if I may say so, is over the House of Commons taking control of its agenda, because when people go to the polls, they elect a government. They elect a Conservative government or a Labour government, or at any rate that's what they seek to do. So they elect a government on the basis of a programme, and the government is elected to carry out that programme. And it follows from that, it seems to me, that if the government is to carry out the programme on which it was elected, it needs to be, if not in control of the agenda, at any rate to a very large degree, which is the case, because of course the government doesn't wholly command the agenda. The usual channels are very active in this, and in general, when Parliament is working normally, the usual channels ensure that the way in which business is conducted does have the acquiescence, if not the agreement, of the minority parties. So I think the idea of the House having control of its agenda would go contrary to what the purpose of a general election was about.
Do you want to answer any of them? And I think we've got someone here who's had their hand up for a while. But let's just.
Nothing much to do with the previous speaker, unfortunately. But I'd like to come back to your opening remarks, where you said two things which seem to me to be relatively paradoxical. You mentioned the House of Lords and democracy, and you also said it was doing its job. You then went on to talk about new things that could be brought into Parliament, and the question I have for you is, to what extent could we use a reformed House of Lords with, possibly, if I can use the word, relatively more democracy in the House of Lords, in order to actually add functionality into that process, or even the process that you're actually talking about? Why can we not use the House of Lords more efficiently? You say it's doing its job. People like me are upset by even the prospect that an undemocratic system like that can be doing its job.
Come in on those questions?
I can.
Yeah, and then we'll
If you
take
wish,
some more
I'll-
in a second.
I'll
Yeah.
take. Now, Sarah said something in comment to my book. I'm not really very concerned about this business of more democratic. We don't have any metric of what is more democratic. And real democracies are enormously different. We don't know if the Swiss democracy, where they use referendums or not, is it more democratic? We don't know. But I'm very concerned about the effectiveness of democratic government. The effectiveness. You know what? And really what troubles democracy today is that we citizens are dissatisfied with the effectiveness of the way we are governed. The House of Lords, I should say that Christopher was speaking, is a member of the House of Lords, so you can have a discussion with Christopher on this matter. But the House of Lords does more scrutiny of legislation than the House of Commons. Now that is not right. That is not right. And what I would want to do is to push much of that back to the House of Commons. Now this is not a miracle cure that would solve everything, but it is a possible change now that would solve something. Now on Christopher's comment on the guillotine, now one of the magics of this proposal is that the House of Commons would have, MPs would have much more work to do, but their capacity for doing work would be much increased at the same time, because much of the work would be done in select committees, and much more work on different matters could be done at the same time. And there's no reason why work on a law should be interrupted just because Parliament no longer sits. Committees could continue to work. There's no reason why we have these complicated procedures that when the Parliament session comes to an end, the legislation that has not been passed falls by the wayside, and we run out of time. It doesn't. So there are elements in this proposal that would address some of those issues you rose. Now, on the control of their business question, I'd say that it doesn't work like this in other democracies and parliaments. You know, it's a very unique British view that that government has a mandate from elections, therefore needs to be in control of business in order to carry its mandate through. It works very well in almost all other democracies that there is a balance, another kind of balance between the executive and the legislature, where the legislature is in more control of the business. In fact, it would improve the government's work because the government would meet more resistance. It would have its work tested better than it now does. In my view, for example, the Committee of Speakers, as select committees, would have the power to return a bill to the government and say, you haven't prepared it well enough, take it back. We're not going to deal with it. And no government would want that humiliation, so it would be impossible to come to Parliament with poorly prepared legislation, which, face it, sometimes does happen now. So I'm not persuaded by that argument, as you are not persuaded by mine, but on this, but I'm glad we agree on the scrutiny issue. And then the other matters are more procedural, they're more technical, but I think it is an essential part of it that Parliament takes control. And not just for legislation, because that Parliament takes control of its agenda. This would improve the standing of the House of Commons and the authority and the respect that the House of Commons could command in the constitutional arrangement, which also, in my opinion, would be very much for the good.
We had a hand there and a hand there. Oh, brilliant, thank you. And then there'll be others. And come in from the side also. Come in. Oh.
Do you think that we might have a better parliament, and possibly even a better democracy, with an alternative system of voting?
And should we, did you have a question? Yeah.
Hello, before I start, can I say how much I agree with that? Secondly, I have a copy of Stein's book. I've read it. I snitched an early copy, and a very great book it is. It won't inhibit me from buying several copies afterwards. I simply say that.
It's a good friend, this is.
At the heart of your book lies the central problem of power and the equation of power and how you control it. And one of the problems with our democracy now, touched on over there, and I couldn't see who did it, but also is the system of government which we've adopted in this country, which is no longer a cabinet government, beloved of Dicey and we have a presidential system, and a strong presidential system as well, but we do not have the checks and balances which are built into most presidential systems. Those checks and balances do not exist. And at the root of that lies something which was touched on here, patronage. And we have a system whereby our government comes from the House of Commons. It is effectively appointed by the Prime Minister. And therefore, if you want to be in government, you have to be appointed by the very person who you are supposed to be controlling. And in terms of conflict of interest, there is a massive conflict of interest. Because if you control the executive, you're likely never to serve the executive. So it's as simple as that. Now, how you square that circle. There's no chance at all, I agree with Stein, wholesale root and branch reform leading to the checks and balances built into, for instance, an American system. We're not going to get there. But where we will get there, and this is what is interesting about Stein's book, is by a huge increase in the power of the select committees within Parliament. And that is not just a peripheral thing, it is an absolutely central thing. Parliament first identified it, we had some success then, and as you rightly say, the momentum has been lost. Now, what therein lies, I'm sorry to go on about this, that members of Parliament themselves, I believe that people enter politics for one of two reasons. Firstly, to achieve power, secondly, to control it. Now, what we need is an ethos in Parliament consisting of people who want to control power, who are there in order to control power, and who see as part of their essential being to control power, not to achieve it. Very often that's quite useful if people have the remotest chance of achieving it in the first place. But also having a parallel system, literally a parallel system, whereby power to control Parliament lies in the hands of a separate group of people is surely the way forward. And the way that has been done, everything is there and possible at the moment, and that's where Parliament can do it. Parliament can achieve the power of its own select committees, and indeed we have seen the chairmen of select committees who have become enormously powerful and very influential in government. And all of that needs is the momentum to get that started again. Now, I have to ask a question because do you agree with that?
And do we have one more in this section here? We'll come to the ones up there in a bit. Do you want to come back on any of that now? Yes, no answer, I think, isn't it?
Are we going to?
Let's take one more, okay.
Cheers, thanks.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that we're already at a possible trigger point for changing the democracy in the UK for the better. Perhaps that trigger point is larger and scarier than ever really considered. Brexit, of course, is the B word in most discussions these days, but it's possibly going to completely change the makeup of the United Kingdom. You're risking Northern Ireland changing its relationship with the UK, you're risking Scotland changing its relationship with the UK. And I'm not going to predict what's going to happen because we have no idea, but it will change or could change. Do you think that small changes like empowering the select committees, for example, are enough to stem the tide of the damage that Brexit could do to the UK? Because if it can, then this is wonderful, and this could change the direction of travel and bring it to a more sort of sensible and more grounded approach, because a lot of EU election policy is, EU policy from the Parliament is a bit questionable, I think. But if it can, it's wonderful. If it can't, what else do we need to do?
Do you want to deal with three now?
Yes, I agree. This, by the way, is Bob Marshall Andrews, the gentleman I mentioned who was member of Parliament first when they were operating. Yes, I agree. And it is another of the proposals here that countries that have electoral systems of our kind, Britain, they should move to a system of proportional representation. I'm not pushing that here this afternoon, reason being that I want to concentrate on this little matter that I think could happen, but there are, and Sarah has mentioned it, there are lots of proposals in this book. And one of them is precisely that, changing the electoral system. Now, I don't want to comment on Brexit specifically, but when I say, I said there needs to be strict procedures of scrutiny in select committees. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. A bill comes to Parliament, it goes to a select committee, which looks at it and tears it apart and so on. The select committee prepares a report which goes back to plenum, to Parliament, which then discusses the matter on the basis of their report. that report, and now things are getting very technical, that report needs to be in writing, and there needs to be specified what it should contain. It should contain always, as a duty on the Select Committee, deliberation on constitutional, administrative, and economic consequences of the proposal that lie before them. Now, when the Brexit referendum bill went to Parliament, it was adopted like that. The House of Commons did no reflection on it. Now, under my system, it couldn't happen that way. There would have to be time taken to give the matter consideration, and the relevant Select Committee would have to pronounce on constitutional, administrative, and economic consequences. And Parliament, the House of Commons, would have imposed upon itself rules whereby it couldn't make those kind of snap decisions in important matters. So the decision in the House of Commons on the Brexit referendum would have taken a different shape. There would have been time, and there would have to be careful deliberation on the matter.
Good. Someone up there? Sorry, thank you. And do you have a preferred voting system, Sarah? If we're going to move to PR, would you? Big question.
Yes, I mean, one of the commentators said that when we vote in an election, we vote for a government. In fact, in the UK, we vote for a parliament. And because we don't have a direct vote for government, it becomes obvious we have a hung parliament because there are various different government combinations that could form, precisely because we don't vote for a specific government. And in some countries that have proportional representation, they regularly have reconfigurations of government with different political parties without having an election in between. And it seems to me that having that possibility would, I should think, invigorate the backbench process of deliberation, because it would give backbench MPs a lot more power if their support was necessary to keep government in power. So possibly the electoral system would be linked to some of the internal parliamentary organisational issues that you're talking about. And I could go into types of proportionate representation at great length, but it is quite late in the day, so I want to keep everyone awake. So yeah, but PR.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks. Just on the proposals on the Select Committee system, the right reforms envisaged a stronger Select Committee system, but to keep that ethos going, does that not require a more well-resourced, more authoritative liaison committee to push forward the scope of the reforms that you envisage? Because that's been lacking for the last decade, if not more.
Yes, but you know, someone like myself who's interested in organizations, I have a look at the House of Commons, and you know, I'm ready to opt out. I mean, this is a big organization, 650 members, huge administration, lots of people, and it is, you know, from an organizational point of view, one cannot exaggerate how inefficient this organization is. You know, the amount of work that that organization produces on lawmaking is derisory. So big improvements could be made in the capacity of that organization by reforms in the way it works. Now, the committees would obviously have to have support in their work on lawmaking. But, you know, the lawmakers have the capacity and are able to do a lot of work. Now, one question would come up is, how should laws actually be written? Now, I don't know if you read a British law recently. I mean, you know, they are unreadable. They are written as a system of cross-references to other laws and so on. You know, Tom Bingham, the eminent lawyer, judge, wrote a little book a few years ago called Rule of Law. And he did this argument. He said that citizens do not have a duty to obey laws they do not know about. So it's very important that laws are published and citizens know them. But he said, if laws are written in such a way that citizens can't understand them, do citizens then have a duty of obeying those laws? And British laws, in the way they are, they're not written by parliamentarians. They're written by an office of scribes that sits somewhere in the depths of I don't know where. And they are incomprehensible and opaque in the way they are written. So it would be a very good thing if parliamentarians themselves did more work on actually writing the laws. Actually writing, I mean technically writing them. So there's capacity there. There's lots of capacity in the House of Commons if it's used and organized well.
Good. Anyone? Do I see any others? Okay. Oh, we got. Oh, good. One. We'll take this last one, and then should we go to drinks?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
I think, yeah.
It does work. I mean,
tell us who you are, please.
My name is Paul Seaward. A long time ago, I was a clerk, but I'm also a historian.
Thanks, Paul.
I mean, it's fascinating listening to this debate and the feeling that there is a thing called Parliament and there's a thing called government, and they're sort of somehow separate. And that's the fundamental sort of misapprehension that exists, that is really, really difficult to unpick. I mean, what is Parliament in the UK? It's really difficult to find a centre for it. And, you know, one of your proposals about having this committee of speakers and Parliament taking control of itself, I'm not sure what the itself is that can take control of Parliament. There's no centre to Parliament. It's sort of the fundamental problem of this whole concept, that you can do it within the structure. And that's why, I mean, as lots of the points being made have illustrated, really, you know, what sounds like a small reform is actually snowballs into quite a big reform. What you're essentially talking about is a remodelling of the whole system of Parliament. So it's more like a continental system. So you do elect a Parliament that is separate from the government. And I think that's a fantastic thing to do. I think that's where a sensible Parliament should head, and I think it's entirely bound up with things like PR. You know, having a system work, having a better system work within a first past the post system is very, very difficult. I think all of these it's a very intricate ecology, really, that you start to unpick. I mean, you know, fine, pre-legislative scrutiny is not a difficult thing to do, and you know, there is a as people have pointed out, there have been examples before, and it could be done before again. But when you just think about, you know, the current legislative session, for example, there are 2 bills there that have just been sort of announced, which weren't in the Queen's speech. How do you do pre-legislative scrutiny when you have governments that sort of legislate on the hoof in response to particular political problems? It shouldn't be done. You know, in an ideal world, that would not be the sort of thing that happened. But I think the main point I wanted to make was one that, you know, Parliament doesn't really have a heart in the sense of a sort of controlling mind. It has lots of different minds. And the other is that this is a very intricate ecology.
What was the last thing?
It's a very intricate ecology.
Well, of course, if the House of Commons sat down to think about this idea, they would get into the details and the implications of those details. So although I say this is a simple idea, of course it isn't. I agree with it. And there's much more, in a way, that's hidden away in this idea than I have presented. But I wouldn't buy the idea that there is no such thing as Parliament. Parliament, the House of Commons, is the 650 representatives. They are the House of Commons. And in my vision of it, I would like those 650 people to be more an institution and less a battlefield that they are. And in committees, they are. You know, the work that goes on in committees is good. No members from the different, they collaborate, they get along. They're outside of the head of the lights. People from different sides work well together, practically. More work of that kind, careful. More detailed elaboration of technical matters in legislation. It will be all for the good. It will be a different kind of work. Of course, there are implications. But on the other hand, this kind of proposal is one that can be taken forward without, at the same time, taking everything else forward. Election system, the House of Lords, and so on. So it can be done. It can be done. One doesn't need to pull everything into it. If the House of Commons adopted this kind of pre-legislation scrutiny of legislature, that would have consequences for the House of Lords, because there would be a different role for the House of Lords. A lot of the work that is done in the House of Lords would effectively be shifted to committees in the House of Commons. So there are big implications, but those implications do not have to be pulled in. One can work on this proposal independently of the various consequences they may or may not follow.
Thank you. So I think that's very good. So I think now we should first thank the speakers, the excellent panel we had.